Good afternoon and welcome everyone to the online masterclass series on critical agrarian studies. Um, I I'd like to invite Dr. Suresh Babu, Dean School of Human Ecology, to welcome the audience and open the talk today.
Good evening, everybody. I hope I'm audible. Um it's a pleasure, really. Today we have Dr. Mukulika Banerjee addressing the participants today in the masterclass on critical agrarian studies. We had Professor Meher Shah in the last session, and from what I recall, it was very lively discussion towards the end. And in fact, there were questions on democracy that emerged at multiple points, and therefore, um, very strong connections to today's session. Thank you, Dr. Mukulika, for agreeing to be part of this series, and we look forward to your session. I welcome everybody on behalf of School of Human Ecology. I would request Buddhaditya to formally introduce the speaker, and then we can continue with the session. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Babu. Good afternoon again and warm welcome to everyone. I'm Dr. Bodhaditya Das. I teach at the School of Human Ecology. It is my privilege to welcome students, scholars, and researchers from India and different parts of the world to this event in the Masterclass series on critical agrarian studies. The series is being organized by the School of Human Ecology at Ambedkar University, Delhi. The idea for a masterclass series emerged when Professor Asmita Kabra and I were trying to respond to the challenge of online teaching for an elective course taught by Professor Kabra titled Agrarian Change and Rural Development to the master students. We reached out to Professor Mekhla Krishnamurthy, who is also here today at Ashoka University. And a discussion among the three of us made us realize the space and the need for a series of lectures that would introduce key concepts that are essential to the toolkits of students and researchers when we begin to understand the rural. So, towards this, we have tasked our five eminent speakers to introduce the broad sweep of disciplinary and theoretical perspectives on their chosen theme and connect these to the lived realities of agrarian and rural societies from the speaker's own sites. A brief word I'd like to mention about the masterclass series and the critical agrarian studies that we do at the School of Human Ecology. The focus of critical agrarian studies at the School of Human Ecology is on what we have come to refer to as marginal ecologies: grasslands, deserts, drylands, forest frontiers, swidden cultivation areas, and high mountain landscapes in India and elsewhere. These have remained on the margins of mainstream agrarian studies, which is still driven primarily by narratives incubated in the context of intensive agriculture in lowlands and river valleys. But in contemporary times, marginal ecologies are becoming the focus of intense debates on development and sustainability. The land and resources of these areas are of interest to industry as potential sites for mining, hydroelectricity, solar and wind parks, salt panning, cement plants, and special economic zones. They are simultaneously the focus of conservation efforts due to their immense biodiversity values. Caught in the midst of these conflicting pressures are the economically poor, predominantly rural, and increasingly mobile people of these marginal ecologies. The everyday lives, livelihoods, situated histories, political struggles, and changing socio-cultural realities of such communities are the focus of agrarian studies at the School of Human Ecology. The first two lectures in this series, as Dr. Babu mentioned, were delivered by Professor Mekhla Krishnamurthy on agrarian markets and Professor Mihir Shah on water. Today's lecture, I'm very happy to say, is on democracy. I'm honored to introduce the third speaker in our masterclass series today, Professor Mukulika Banerjee. Professor Mukulika Banerjee is a renowned scholar of Indian democracy and in particular of the cultural event that is elections in India. She is the inaugural director of the South Asia Centre at the London School of Economics and Political Science, where she also holds the position of associate professor at the Department of Anthropology. Professor Banerjee completed her PhD from the University of Oxford in 1994 and taught at the University College of London from 1996 to 2009, before joining the London School of Economics and Political Science in 2009. For students of democracy, her most famous monograph is Why India Votes, published by Routledge in 2014. The book answers this very intriguing question based on a comparative research project undertaken across 13 states in India during the Lok Sabha elections of 2009. I will encourage our students to read the book and her recent paper, 2019 paper in the Modern Asian Studies Journal, where she builds upon her argument of the transactional as well as the symbolic value of vote for millions of citizens in our democracy. In case our students are interested, you can also hear the 40-minute documentary directed by her titled The Sacred Election, Lessons from the Biggest Democracy in the World, that is available on the LSE website. Apart from Why India Votes, Professor Banerjee has written the book The Pathan Unarmed, Opposition and Memory in the Northwest Frontier. This is a history of the Khudai Khidmatgar movement in colonial South Asia, based on her doctoral work. She also has a very interesting book co-authored with Daniel Miller on the Sari, the quintessential choice of clothing for millions of Indian women. Professor Banerjee has also edited a volume titled Muslim Portraits, Everyday Lives in India. She is also the founding series editor of the Routledge series on exploring the political in South Asia. I personally find that very useful. It has some excellent monographs and edited volumes on politics and democracy in India and Pakistan. I have no hesitation in saying that there are few scholars better equipped to teach a masterclass on democracy than Professor Mukulika Banerjee. With this, I would like to hand over the stage to our chair and moderator for today's talk, Professor Meghla Krishnamurthy. She will also announce the housekeeping rules for the talk and the discussion. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Buddha, and it is just a huge pleasure and privilege to be here and to have an opportunity to moderate this afternoon, evening a discussion on and Mukulika's masterclass. I'll just very briefly go over the housekeeping rules. So for everyone who's attending, the meeting is being recorded and all audio and video are automatically on mute. Participants can type their questions in the chat box for the moderator. And on YouTube, you can send questions to sheconference@aud.ac.in. I won't stand in the way of the masterclass any further. So I'll hand over to Mukulika and then afterwards look forward to moderating the discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Meghla. Thank you, Ambedkar and the School of Human Ecology, Asmita, Buddha, Dean, and the audience for showing up. Thank you very much for this opportunity to share some of my research thoughts, thinking on democracy, but within this particular frame of the agrarian, which is one that I have thought about, but I think this particular opportunity allows me to focus particularly on this relationship between democracy and the agrarian in particular. So let me start. I'm going to talk you through some slides, which seems to be the best way to visualize some of these arguments. So the first thing to say in the title, Cultivation in Democracy, Activity and Metaphor, is that it is, I use the idea of cultivation, which of course is at the heart of the agrarian, both as a concrete physical activity, as well as a metaphor for what you need to do to create democracy. And you'll see how. Now, this is the argument that I'm presenting here is really the kernel of the argument of my forthcoming monograph, which I've called Cultivating Democracy, Politics and Citizenship in Agrarian India. And there's a lot of detail obviously in the monograph, but I will present some of the key ideas and welcome questions on other aspects of this argument in the discussion period. Now, there's some things that I want you to keep in mind before we start. which are kind of the basic conclusions of the book, and also the basic assumptions of everything I will say, which is that democracy for me is a set of institutions, but it's also culture. So you have democratic institutions such as elections, which bring about political democracy. But democratic culture brings about social and economic democracy. So democracy for me is always a combination of political democracy and social and economic democracy. It's always a combination of institutions of democracy, but also the culture that democracy creates. And this is, of course, at the heart of the constitutional vision of India, and one that Ambedkar was so keen, was paid attention to when the Constitution was written. And this is why all discussions of, say, whether we should have universal franchise, whether there should be reservations, whether there should be different kinds of arrangements that will bring about not just equality and justice, but also fraternity. These are very germane to understanding democracy in this way. And too often, the danger is that we talk about institutions of democracy as if they are divorced from the culture of democracy, and they have absolutely huge implications for the present, as we will see. Now, so therefore, the important questions for India today, where we stand in 2020, is what is this relationship between political democracy that we can achieve through elections and social democracy, which is really what happens in between elections. What happens when elections are over, when society returns to the normal, what kind of democratic society we are in between. Can this distinction, I would argue, be characterized, articulated as a distinction between democracy and the republic, where the two are absolutely intrinsically linked? And for the sake of argument and clarity, we talk about institutional political democracy as democracy. And we talk about the time in between elections, the social and economic democracy as the republic. And I articulate it in these ways because this is exactly the reason why there was such a tussle when India was being inaugurated as a new nation, that the words democracy and republic were both included, which they weren't in the first instance. Initially, India was defined as an independent sovereign nation, and Ambedkar insisted that India be called a sovereign democratic republic. So there is a reason why the words republic and democracy are both there, and that informs much of what I'm going to be saying. Though I'm not really going to talk about this in much greater detail in the talk, but happy to talk about it in the discussion. But what, for an anthropology of democracy, as an anthropologist, in order to understand democracy, therefore, in this fullest sense, we need to study both electoral and non-electoral times. We need to understand both electoral and non-electoral times. We need to see both political and social democracy together. So you've got to study them within the same frame. And therefore, any discussion of democracy that focuses on elections and nothing else is an incomplete study of democracy as far as an anthropologist of democracy is concerned, or certainly for myself. And this is the important, and here, therefore, the importance of the ethnographic method has to be established, where ethnographic study of democracy is present, pays equal attention to electoral and non-electoral times. My initial question, as Buddha mentioned in my previous work, was really driven, the reason why I got interested in studying democracy was really to address this question: why do Indians vote in such high numbers? Because, as you know, in 1998, the survey done by Lokniti, the National Election studies showed that, of course, that voter turnouts were going up. We knew that from Election Commission data. But also the survey revealed that at that point, in the late 90s, rural, socially disadvantaged citizens were more likely to vote than others. And this has changed since then, but certainly this was the picture then. And it has changed in as much as that more urban citizens have caught up with rural citizens. But at that point, this was a really interesting question to me. So the way to approach this was to just look at Indian elections and what they stood for. Basic characteristics: the voter turnout has been greater than 66%. It has been larger for local elections than for national elections, very much against the grain of other older democracies in the world. More women vote than men. We saw this in Bihar recently this month, where many more women voted than men. The size of the electorate is huge, and I think that number needs updating. It's bigger than that. The number of polling stations in a Lok Sabha election is greater than 1 million polling stations. I mean, that's a huge number. So we're talking about a really big, vast democratic exercise. But my research question was, why on earth people so committed to the act of voting? And the short answer, there's a longer answer, and it's in the book Why India Votes, but the short answer is that the voting experience itself is a very positive one for a lot of people. And again, this is something we'll come back to. This map on the right of the slide is always, I like this slide because it just puts Indian democratic experiment into perspective. If you just look at the size of the electorate, it shows you, compared to other national democracies, just how big this democracy is in India. So each state in India is the size of very sizable nations in the world. I decided to set up field research in West Bengal, a state where I've never lived myself. I grew up in Delhi, but I speak Bengali, so I could do fieldwork, which of course you need to do in the local language for an anthropologist. And this is what the West Bengal map looked like if you're studying elections and democracy. It has 42 parliamentary constituencies. This is, you had to choose a field site here. And again, I won't go into how I found these two villages of which I call Madanpur and Chishti in West Bengal. And it was a systematic sampling technique I used to find these villages. But anyway, I landed up here, and this was in 1998. And since then, I have continued to visit and work and research in these villages. This is what Madanpur looked like a few years ago. This is. It hasn't changed very much. I was last there in September in 2019. It's a mixture, as you can see, of some pakka houses, a lot of thatch and mud houses, and its twin village, literally across the highway on the other side, the big highway that you saw in the first image, is Chishti, which looks like this, with its collection of pukurs and bamboo groves and big trees, very typical of the West Bengal landscape. I won't talk about him that much today, but just to note, this big boundary wall you see on the right is the comrade's house. He was the most important political actor in these villages. And I know that Kenneth is speaking at the next masterclass, and you'll hear more about communist comrades and other political actors in his. And I'm very happy again to talk about it if you wanted me to. But the question I want to focus on is that what can this kind of village-based ethnography offer to the study of democracy? So the first thing is it's a long-term engagement in a research site. And as I said, I've been making annual visits since 1998, sometimes stayed there for several months, others for shorter visits, but the regularity has been kept up over this period of time. I'm interested, therefore, in elections, of course. I try and get there whenever there is an election, but I am interested as much in when there is no election. So my friends in the village know when I land up before an election, they say, oh yeah, there you are. We knew you would show up. But then I would show up before a harvest, before Muharram, like in September when I went. These are largely Muslim villages. And for other, just when I could go, when nothing much was happening, just to see what everyday life was like. So, throughout in any ethnographic project, of course, as opposed to doing field work, as a lot of people have begun to do within social sciences, there are some things that make ethnography distinct from fieldwork. And one very important characteristic of this is we are interested in watching what people do, not just asking them questions all the time. Because often people say something, but when it comes to doing it, they might do something very different. And there are different reasons for this. And again, we can talk about it. But from the point of view of studying democracy and elections, it is the acknowledgement of a very fundamental fact that we know from our own personal biographies, that a voter is embedded in social life, after all. Outside of elections, a voter is a farmer, she's a mother, she may be doing daily wage work, she may be pious, she may be, she may like salty food. I mean, there are a number of ways in which you can humanize and contextualize a voter. And this brings a texture to our understanding of how people behave as democratic citizens in elections and outside of it in particular ways. And we need to think about this very systematically. We pay, therefore, attention as much to economic and social life as we do to elections. And we therefore take the agrarian, village life in its entirety, and the activity of cultivation seriously as sites of the political. So the siting of the political is not located only in what is an obviously a political institution of the election, but all these other aspects of village life are as much a site of the political. So how do we, just to go over the political story in these villages, as has been the case for most of West Bengal, has been this tension between the CPM and Trinamool. When I started, the CPM looked invincible in 1998. It looked like the BJP looks at the national level at the moment. We never thought the CPM would lose an election. And then by the time I end, at least the period covered in my book, in 2013, Trinamool wins the Panchayat elections and are completely in charge. So there is a big political story that I'm telling. There's a story of religion here, which is of Islam, its changing nature over this 15-year period and longer that I've been going back and forth to it. And I take those that story of religion very seriously for our understanding of democracy. And then for the purposes especially of today's talk and this audience, the importance of paddy and wheat cultivation as the primary economic activity. It is not the sole economic activity, very much like those marginal ecologies that Buddha was talking about, that there is a dry riverbed where there's always at least one brick kiln on the go. There is fisheries and hatcheries, sand, bricks, coal, pilfered coal. People have gone through different, every time I go back there is a new experiment. They tried growing poppy for a while because because of the agrarian crisis. People were looking for solutions. And what Mihir was saying, Professor Shah was saying at the last masterclass, is exactly the story here. This is a story where the water table has dropped and people are struggling to grow paddy and wheat anymore, and they're digging deeper and deeper, using more and more fuel, and therefore the inputs are getting more and more expensive to create a crop whose prices are dropping. So this is a real crisis in this village, and people are experimenting with different kinds of economic activity. Now, an early conclusion from studying religion, the economy, kinship and social life, and then elections, was my conclusion that in a place like Madanpur and Chishti, elections have come to become these sacrosanct moments that people feel absolutely bound towards. So they feel if an election happens, they must vote. They feel an inviolate commitment to voting. And I published an early paper on this. But then, as with any anthropological fieldwork, the challenge is always to say, well, that may be true for your village, but what about the rest of the country? And so we took this idea of elections being sacrosanct and tested it across different sites across India, marked with these red dots, with a team of people who all then took these findings from Madanpur and Chishti and tested some of those ideas that people had about elections in their own sites across India in 2009 when the elections were happening. And this was published. Our findings across India was published in Why India Votes. There are obviously lots of conclusions from Why India Votes, but a broad conclusion is that while a lot of academic research on Indian elections quite rightly focus on money and muscle in Indian elections, the criminality, the overwhelming importance of money, the lack of transparency about electoral funding, that is absolutely true. But there was something, if you looked at elections not from the top, but from the bottom, from the point of view of the voter and their experience, how they apprehended elections, then elections were also very meaningful moments for them, for the way in which they were able to renew a sense of citizenship in the act of voting. So that is important. Now, this is a good point as any to clarify that what I say about Indian elections here is very much a set of conclusions about Indian elections as they existed before 2014. I've also been writing, as have others, that Indian elections have changed dramatically in their character, in their probity, in their integrity since 2014, and there are very good reasons for it. And I'm happy to talk about it, but please take my conclusions about Indian elections and what voters feel about them as valid up to 2014. So the meaning, if there was money and there was meaning, the meaning of the vote is what? That actually right across the country, there was remarkable similarity. People considered elections to be sacrosanct. They considered it an important act of citizenship, which they felt was a fundamental duty of citizenship. As a citizen, you had a duty to vote, but it was also an exercise of a foundational right. You could vote, and therefore you should, and you absolutely must. The experience of voting, and this really is something I haven't seen much discussion about, but anecdotally, when I ask people about their experience of voting, including my students, just yesterday teaching a class on related issues, a student describing her experience of voting in Haryana confirmed what our research showed across India, that the polling station itself is a very interesting site where there is genuine social mingling and a space of dignity for all. So that idea of popular sovereignty that we associate with democracy is actually instantiated in the act of, in the way the polling station, the culture of the polling station itself. And I'm beginning to think that really when we think about how far we have, India has managed to achieve any semblance of fraternity, which is under such assault at the moment. The polling station, to my mind, is one of those spaces of fraternity, where it is not just about that vertical relationship of who you're voting for, but also the relationship that you have with other citizens present to exercise their right as voters. So that horizontal relationship of what we might call, what I was saying at the beginning, is democratic culture, is really something that you feel in a polling station, in the way that people, queues are managed, in the silence and the dignity, and the fact that it it is the only space in Indian public life where it doesn't matter who you are. If you have your photo identity card, you have a right to be there, and nobody can tell you to move to the bottom of the queue in a way that almost any other context makes impossible. So this is as far as we got with the voting story in Why India Votes. But the larger argument it is part of is that there are this idea that you can begin to consider something so new, an institution such as elections, which is such a new thing, as a sacrosanct moment, as something that you have an inviolate duty to, is really possible, because I would say that institutions and cultures in social life in India, and in this case agrarian, rural India, produce what I call social imaginaries that allow for this kind of political imagination. And that's what the remainder of my talk will be really about. So in Cultivating Democracy, this forthcoming book, I make this basic argument that village life, agrarian village life, creates democratic values which are the social imaginaries of democracy. And by that, I mean that all those non-political spaces, the mosque, the harvest, the fields, the sitting around chatting in the afternoon while women weave their mats, it's all those kinds of moments which have nothing ostensibly to do with political democracy, that have to do with elections. They create the social imaginaries that you need to create a democratic culture. That's the argument that I'm making. So what are social imaginaries? It's a term I borrow from Charles Taylor, who talks about social imaginaries as a shared understanding. It is not quite political theory, but it is more than just common sense. There is a certain, you can say, a vernacular theorizing that goes on in all our minds, all citizens, regardless, say, of the education level you have or literacy levels you have. And all of you, here listening to this, any of you who've traveled in India, who've talked to people who are not of your class, people who are uneducated, India is a particularly good society to study this, because everybody has an opinion, everybody has an understanding, everybody thinks about things quite deeply. A lot of people do. And it is that thinking deeply, which is not common sense, where you reflect, but you're not theorizing at the level of social theory, but it's a series of reflections, but one also that you share with other people. It is this realm of shared understanding that the idea of social imaginaries takes you to, that social organization and social structure, in those classic anthropological ways, create social arrangements that shape these imaginaries. And I like this term particularly because, very importantly, it foregrounds the importance of imagination. Now, politics is, if anything, it's about imagination. It is about imagining a future. It is about imagining social relations. If you think about the Constitution of India, it is an imagination. It's a constitutional imagination that is being articulated there, where not only will Indians be able to elect their new rulers from now on going forward, but they're also going to redefine their relationship to each other in radically new ways, defined as the term fraternity. So, of all these different social moments, events in village life, the one that I, for obvious reasons, chose to talk about today is the harvest, which is one of the 4 events that I talk about in the book. The story of harvests in West Bengal is, and certainly in my village, West Bengal is a big state, there's a huge amount of variation across it. So let me talk about the story of cultivation and harvests in my village. This is, as I said, this was dominated by the Left Front in 1998. The government who won power in 1977 and held on to power right up until 2011. So we have this long period of communist dominance. And one of the early things that the communists fought for and did rather badly and unevenly, but still managed to achieve in some pockets, was land reform. Now, what did land reform happened after decades of violence. It came after decades of different kinds of violence. They remained incomplete, but where it was achieved, as with the villages of Madanpur and Chishti, what you got was a very interesting set of consequences, and that's what I have listed here in these different clusters. So one cluster of issues is under the direct consequences of land reform. The main thing was under Operation Borga, there was increased secured tenancy for sharecroppers. So sharecroppers, from having a very precarious existence on very, very low and precarious wages, went to a point where they had much more security in what they, in where they were going to live and work the following year. And the daily wage for work, for agricultural work, was raised quite radically, from 3 rupees, 10 rupees, and then straight to 50 rupees. It was a huge leap. Created, obviously, so people got, so labor was rewarded in commensurate terms for the first time. But what it created was a crisis for people who owned land in villages like Madanpur and Chishti, where the size of the landholding was very small. So what anyone who owned land found was that by the time you gave up 50% of your share of the profits, which is what the terms of Operation Borga were, to the sharecropper, and you invested in all the inputs, which the landowner had to do, and paid for daily wages of all the people working on the land, there simply wasn't enough profit for them to survive. So a radical change that happened in places like Madanpur and Chishti was that for the first time ever, people who owned land were actually learning to cultivate themselves. They were doing manual work in the fields for themselves for the first time, because this was the only way, by putting their own shram, their own labor into cultivation, could they mitigate the costs, the increased costs of labor and the 50% share of the profits that they now had to give up. The implications of these institutional reforms for social life and caste, as you can imagine, were radical. So this is a society in which, as I said, it's dominated by a Muslim community. There is some Dom and Bagdi communities as well, who are mostly agricultural workers. But amongst the Muslims, you have Sayyid, Sheikh, Pathan, Mughals, the 4 castes of Muslim societies in West Bengal. And Sayyids predictably owned the land. But because for the first time ever Sayyids had to do manual work, there was a rebalancing of hierarchies. Because while the Sayyids may have made a song and dance and taken to manual work for the first time and bemoaned the loss of their elite status, what also happened was that they were having to do cultivation. They were having to do something that they actually did not know how to do. Cultivation and agricultural practice, as we know, is a series of very specialist knowledge, which they simply did not have. So it was the lower caste sheikhs, and in some case domed sharecroppers, who had always done the cultivation, who knew much better than the Sayyids. So the Sayyids were kind of taking orders from the sheikhs and the domes. And so the act of cultivation, of just cultivating a crop, became this very tense activity, because constantly there was a reassertion of greater knowledge versus caste hierarchy, where the Sayyids were very aware that they were the dominant caste, but they knew they had to defer to the superior experience and knowledge of the lower castes. There is, of course, like I said, a big story of Green Revolution and its consequences behind it. Paddy's output increased tenfold in West Bengal because of the increase in because of the introduction in high-yielding varieties. But what it did, and this is interesting, that instead of swapping, of course, completely to high-yielding varieties, as with elsewhere, people continued to double crop. So they continued to grow both kinds of paddy, the high-yielding variety and Swarna paddy, and in between a crop of wheat. So suddenly from growing one or two crops, they were growing three in an annual agricultural cycle, thereby depleting groundwater terribly, because as we know, high-yielding varieties are very thirsty crops. They need a huge amount of inputs of fertilizers and water, and therefore there was a gradual precarity of land that was being created through the Green Revolution years. So while this began in the 1980s in Madanpur and Chishti, by the time I got there in the late 90s, things were still good. People were cultivating most of their land and getting big returns of crop. But since then, since 98, from 98 until today, every time I go back, this is a hugely fraught question, and less people are cultivating the lands around the village because simply it's too expensive to do this, and the water is just dropped far too low. Now, I deliberately chose this particular image of the grain heap, listening to Mekhla's paper earlier in the series, just to provide an image of what grain heaps look like in small and big quantities. And as you can see, the grain heap is not just the grain, it is all the secondary produce of the crop, of the stock, which is so important for fodder. And the ducks in the picture and the hens allows me to make this other point about this kind of village economy, which, as we know, as Mekhla's work has shown, is a much more, is not just about grain and caste, and Chris Fuller's critique and Mekhla's own work, which has been so important in opening up the continuum between, say, this grain heap and the mandi and what happens in that process. But if we just focus on this image itself, it also focuses our attention that that we are talking about very small scale agriculture, number one. Number two, not all crops have secondary outputs. So for instance, you can tell this is not a high yielding variety grain heap because you simply don't get such long stalks for fodder. And one of the main reasons why people continue to cultivate Swarna paddy is because of that secondary produce which they need for their cattle. Because this is, as Sunita Narayan and others have written about, a large part of India's rural agrarian economy is this human-animal interface where living quarters, space, food, cultivation is shared between animals and humans. And therefore, the importance of growing a crop which produces the right kind of fodder for your animals, and just off the frame, if you just beyond this, in fact, where that tin shed that you can see in the top right corner, it continues into the sheds where the cattle are kept in this particular courtyard. This is in my friend Meher's house. And so the agrarian is as much about animals as it is about human consumption and the market for the grain. And the fact that hen and ducks are allowed to roam freely and sometimes are shooed away, the food is as much theirs. And this is, as you can imagine, this has huge implications for the relationship that human beings have with animals in these kinds of societies. And again, this is something we can talk about. And it helps me set up the argument about why, say, something like Qurbani, Muslim ritual of sacrifice is such an important event to create what I would argue are actually quite critical imaginaries for democracy, but that's another paper and another argument. To come back to this scene and what we've learned about cultivation and harvests, the act of cultivation, therefore, is one that is filled with tension. It requires an enormous amount of patience and vigilance. It is exhausting work. It is about care, and it is about hope. And these, I would like to argue that these are the values and virtues of cultivation as an agrarian activity, but they're exactly the same values that you need to create a democratic culture. So, in this context, in Madanpur and Chishti, where we've got to is that cultivation in a village or villages like this is a combination of, and I could not stop myself from this wonderful set of alliterative terms which were too tempting to bypass, but they really were about, as you saw, communism, about cash, about kinship and labor arrangements, about constitutional rights, and about caste. Now, all of these come together to shape agrarian life and cultivation in these villages, and therefore the texture of the social imaginaries of the political that come out of cultivation as an activity have both these impulses, the agonistic and the reparative. There is the tension of competition, of scarce resources, of one-upmanship, of envy and jealousy, all those, the frisson of those agonisms and disagreements are there in cultivation. But it is also about cooperation, about suppression of individual self-interest, about reaching out in solidarities, about helping and caring for each other that you need to do in the activity of a harvest. The harvest, after all, is a quintessentially collective activity. No individual person can bring in a harvest, however small your field, because there is a whole range of tasks to be accomplished which required shared labor. Now, I would put these two impulses of agonism and the reparative back into that frame of democracy and republic, of political democracy and economic and social democracy, and say that really you actually find both those impulses in cultivation of the competitive and the cooperative, of those that create democracy and also that create the republic. And you need both of these things together in political life. So the wider argument is in the book is that, like I have been showing with the harvest, and I show obviously in greater detail, I pick out some moments of a village life, events, what I call events, very much for especially for sociology, anthropology members of the audience. I've been very influenced in this book by the Manchester School and thinking about events and social dramas and the value of studying events to understand social life in a big way in this book. And again, I'm happy if anyone wants to talk about that. But in this case, I picked these 4 events with the intention of studying what kind of social imaginaries they produce. So the first event, which the book opens with, is of a sexual scandal between 2 young people. But in the unfolding of that scandal, which is a classic sort of Victor Turner kind of social drama, it causes competition and gossip, but it is also resolved, and as we know from the anthropological study of gossip, it is about creating ethical moral frameworks. It is about identifying your values. It is about sharing that solidarity with people who share those values. And these are achieved when there is fission, when there are schisms between people caused by a breach, such as a sexual scandal and what it caused, the cross-cutting ties of kinship and friendship actually help repair that. So we learn something about how competition is managed, how disagreement is managed, how ruptures are repaired through the study of the event of the scandal. Harvests, as we have seen in slightly greater detail today, create cross-caste class cooperations and participation. And this institutional reform, and they're very important. You couldn't have had this in a harvest in the 1970s, for instance, because institutional reforms have been important in reportioning and reassigning dignity, of people being able to reclaim dignity as social groups because of those institutional reforms of land redistribution and communist ideology. Let's face it, the one thing that communism does for West Bengal is introduces a language of dignity and rights to each and every person, whatever kind of work they do. And this is a huge legacy of the communism itself that we see at work in the harvest. The third event I talk about is of Qurbani that I mentioned, where I would argue that alongside, again, everything else, a ritual of animal sacrifice is much more about redistribution rather than consumption. It's not really about eating meat. It's about who you give the sacrificed meat to. There is a reinforcement of the egalitarian ideals of Islam in the way that people line up to say their prayers in the masjid, that there is a commitment to standing next to whoever turns up is a very important aspect of how Eid prayers are organized. And also this very important repertoire of giving that each of these Islamic festivals bring in, that Eid may be one day, but the festival of Eid actually brings into play a whole season of giving away, giving in charity, but also not keeping any excess, of being able. So it's the principle of redistribution that very much is at work in how people are thinking about how much they can give, who to give to, and so on. And again, I can talk about this more. And then when we look, having looked at these very non-political, and obviously political with a capital P, these are not political institutions. But then when we look at the fourth event, which is an election, we see that this idea of inviolate commitment that people have towards elections is actually produced in very non-political settings, such as if a harvest has to be brought in, you don't say, oh, I don't feel like going today to the fields. You do it because you just absolutely have to. Or you don't not celebrate Eid because that's what you do. There's some things you just do because that's how you live in communities. And it is that inviolate sense that is brought to elections. And this fraternity of the polling station, therefore, also is a fraternity that is glimpsed in these other moments, I would argue, say in Eid prayers, or say in a line of people cutting the grain. And the fact that even elite Sayyids are now covered in paddy dust like everybody else, and everybody literally physically resembles each other. These are quite important markers of a new kind of self-making of citizenship. And finally, therefore, if one had to take away the conclusions of what this kind of study does to our understanding of democracy, I would reinforce that idea of ethnography, where you are attentive to how people conduct themselves. I mean, during a harvest, if you try to go and do fieldwork, nobody has time to talk to you. You're actually left to your devices. You just stand there and watch and try and make sense of what is going on. And so ethnography and attention to things that may seem completely irrelevant being actually quite relevant later when you take the long view is worth keeping in mind. That agrarian life itself contains institutions and social arrangements that create the values required for democratic culture. This is what I was that actually help create democratic cultures. I'm not saying they are the only things that create democratic cultures, but they certainly help create them. These values are created as much in non-political moments as in political moments. And therefore, if you want to understand democracy or democratic politics, you have to pay attention to those non-electoral agrarian moments as well as the electoral moments. Because democracy, just like paddy growing, requires constant cultivation and active engagement in the way that agriculture does. And so finally, I just want to end with this thought, because for many of us who have been studying Indian democracy, I think what we are witnessing in India today at the moment is an assault on both democratic institutions and democratic cultures. That's the assault that we are witnessing. The only way, and when Mihir was saying we need more democracy, we need people to get more engaged, we're really talking about that kind of political action, which I would put under the category of active citizenship, not just the formal citizenship of what is said on your electoral photo identity card, but active citizenship, which is about holding to account, of questioning, of creating solidarities with people, of asking questions, which really is what we do rather well at universities, or one can hope for. So I'll end there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mukulika, for that really, I think both challenging in an agonistic way and reparative in a different way of thinking, particularly about democracy at this moment. I'm sure there will be a number of questions, and so I will invite everybody listening to either send in the email to she@aud. That email address that I had said, but I will pull it out again, and maybe Buddha can put it on the chat, or one of you could just do that, and also to use the chat box for those of you here to ask your questions. But while we collect questions, I just wanted to put one question out there, taking my privilege as chair on this, which is you started with this very important point about observation and the ethnographic, and not what people just say, but what they do. But in many ways, that has also been the practice of political economy, which is to often say that there's rhetoric versus reality, and to actually compose a sense of Indian democracy in practice by looking at forms of contestation, patronage, interests, and other kinds of relationships, right? Which in fact then say that while you're democratic in statement and constitution, when you actually look at what happens, you see, the arguments around patronage, democracy, and others. So you're putting forward for us an idea of imaginaries. Now, imaginaries have to be articulated or experienced or expressed. And you seem to have done so by juxtaposition, right? By being able to see them working together across multiple things, because these are harvests could happen in quote unquote non-democratic societies too. And do they then cultivate the virtues of democracy there as well? So does sacrifice, right? But it seems that when a number of things come together, you then have, this kind of engagement with the idea of the imaginary becomes visible, and its interactions become visible. So I'm just wondering whether, it's not just an articulated imaginary. People, they may be able to articulate it, but I'm not sure if you interview people and ask them, does the harvest help you cultivate a democratic disposition? They may too. But I'm just wondering, how does one, both methodologically and in terms of the larger theoretical insights, right? But also the political insights for our modes of engagement. If you had something to say about that, and then I'll collect questions, which I see are pouring in.
Okay. mean, I think it's worth saying that you can obviously, like you said, have democracies in non-agrarian settings, and you can have agrarian settings in the vice versa happens. I don't think if you asked people, uh, does cultivating paddy help you become a democratic citizen, a better democratic citizen, you're going to get very far in a conversation. And I think this is where uh, being a field worker and an ethnographer and being an anthropologist is distinct. Anthropology is about taking, it's that famous Tim Ingold piece, which anthropology is about being able to make a theoretical intervention on the basis of what you learn as an ethnographic field worker. And in this case, I would say that what people said to me was, you want to understand politics, you've got to be here for a harvest. And somebody said this to me very quietly, that, I can see that you're interested in politics, because, of course, when I first started fieldwork, you couldn't talk about politics because people were so terrified of the comrade and the communists. So nobody could talk about politics. So you had to always come to political issues obliquely. And in that context, one of my friends said, if you want to understand democracy, you must come and come during a harvest. And it's because you see the agonisms of cultivation at work. Presumably, is that what he was saying? But he was also, I think, indicating the importance of being able to see how people were able to rise above differences in common cooperative effort, which is what a harvest is. So imaginaries are not articulated in the way that I am articulating them, because that is the task of, that's what anthropology does. That's what the academic study of this is, more than just a description or a reportage of what you observe. But I think what people do articulate, it reminds me, it's very interesting that it was at the end of a harvest that I was told this story, which is just so astonishingly perfect. But it was a harvest gave rise to somebody in the sort of post-harvest exhilaration and exhaustion tells me the story of the king and the rice pudding, which I've published in earlier papers, where the king had a feast for the village and said he would provide all the food, but everybody would need to contribute a cup of milk to the rice pudding. And there was a miser in the village who said, why should I give my 1 cup of milk to a pudding that everybody's going to eat? I'm just going to quickly go there and lift the lid and put some water. And when everybody had the feast and was very happy, very satisfied and looking forward to the pudding, they lifted the lid and guess what they found? A big vat of water, because everybody had the idea of saving a cup, of withholding that individual contribution towards a common good. And the people told me this story as a way of explaining what is the relationship between individual contributions and a collective effort is. So that's the kind of articulation of imaginaries you get doing fieldwork, not what I have presented here.
No, it's also great because I think so much of the ethnographic literature and the political science, political sociology literature until now has looked at some of these practices, irrigation, cultivation, to talk about state formation, to talk about bureaucratization, rather than to consider it from the point of view of democratic cultures. So we have an interesting literature on irrigation and the kinds of states that you have. But that's very different from, I think, the arguments that you're pushing at. I have a number of questions, so I'm going to try and put them together to give you a chance to sort of, really push forward on some of this. So the first two actually are focused around change. And of course, the study of democracy and of agrarian change has been about continuity and change. So let me pose these questions. So Asmita, says she's fascinated by the parallel you are drawing between agrarian production and democracy. But the agrarian itself is under massive transformation in India, with greater migration, mobility, and a much greater share of the non-farm and rural livelihoods. So how does this affect then the practice of democracy? And the other side, right, of thinking about this, which is from Vishal Prasad, who asks, I'd like to inquire is how has civic engagement changed in these two villages over the years? So do these changes reflect a brewing hatred by the right wing is one particular question. But one side is about civic change, and the other is about agrarian change. And you're bringing, in a sense, the two together in the practice of democracy. And so, you know, if you'd like to take those questions.
Yeah. I'm not sure what civic engagement. Give me an example of civic engagement. Does he say what kind of thing he's thinking about?
No, he doesn't. So just
okay. So let me do what I can with it.
But here is the idea. But you could take it also to think about the way in which certain kinds of participation in institutions might work. Yeah.
With agrarian change, to address Asmita's question, oh, absolutely. I mean, this is not, every time I go back to Madanpur and Chishti, something has changed. It's not the same. There's actually been remarkably less out migration. As it happens, it's a coincidence from this particular location. But people are moving about, boys are being sent away to madrasas, people are going away on, somebody got in the army. There are all kinds of changes. And like I was saying in the talk, one time I arrived and people were only growing poppy because the returns on the poppy crop were very high. But everybody was aware that this was illegal. You're not allowed to grow poppy. They were hiding it under trees and corners of fields so that nobody would see it. But they were desperate. And so the agrarian, you're quite right. Of course, it's constantly changing. And people in dealing with this change are having to think about legality and illegality. The whole trade of sand required and generated a trade in pilfered coal that required young men to cycle through the night in the dark to bring back bags of coal, which they could sell at inflated prices because they were collecting pilfered coal from outside that could be found and stolen, basically, that had fallen off trucks. All kinds of activities which were on the margins of other established economic activities, which people were having to do because that's what they could do. But in doing so, they were constantly thinking about ethical issues, about how they could utilize their labor best to make a living, just to be able to live. This is about survival. Now, I think while all of this is true, I don't think any of this actually alters or I can't see, and you'll have to tell me why this would change the basic argument that I'm making. The argument that I'm saying is not so much about agrarian life being somehow fixed. Instead, I would say that there are elements in an agrarian life which can be examined to see their elective affinity with democratic culture. Some elements of it will not have affinity, others will. And in my case, in the case that I'm describing, some things have greater affinity than others and others don't, which is not to say that you can't find affinities between different kinds of practices. I think, it will be really interesting to think about migration and what the pandemic did to the rural in India this year is a story that needs to be told. And I think people are beginning to write about it. But the fact that I was very struck that people were, all these workers, thousands and thousands and thousands of them that walked back to the village. What were their expectations of the rural? Why were they going back? Yes, it is it's the place of last resort, but as many of them said, it was also the only place where they were guaranteed not to die alone, that they needed a drop of water before they died. There would be someone. It was a place of sociality, however divided by caste, by gender violence, by all the different other problems of the rural more generally beyond the agrarian. So I think the issue of change can be addressed in that way. About democracy and civic engagements, I think the civic engagements,
so sorry, but Vishal has just clarified what he meant also, which is
what do you say?
Of festivities and people's participation in those kinds of activities. And just, to make this link, because there's another question related to that. So his interest is in, civic participation. Here he's also thinking about festivals and other kinds. And I'm thinking he's considering both religious and secular or non-religious forms of engagement. But Anshu Saluja has a question where he says there are particular moments, harvest and certain festivals, for example, that repair ruptures and create shared solidarities. So there also must be similar moments rooted within the everyday that produce or reinforce exclusivist social imaginaries. So if possible, can you please shed light on this aspect? And you've already mentioned that some do have elective affinities and others don't. So you could take those two together, and that clarifies the question as well.
In fact, if you ask me, studying any community and village life, it's easier to spot those that reinforce exclusivist social imaginaries. Indian society in particular is very good for producing exclusivist social imaginaries. We grade people by the color of their skin, by their caste, by their age, by their gender. I mean, our social interactions, if you think about it, are rife with creating exclusivist social imaginaries. So in a village life, that is not hard to find. And so there can be, a whole range of examples for that. The harder thing to find, but your question allows me to address a very important issue, is that, I don't know how many of you have actually lived in a village, but if you live in a village, you realize it is claustrophobic. There is no anonymity. There is so much gossip. I mean, even as a visitor, the lack of trust and the amount of gossip about me that was being spread about was claustrophobic and unbearable. And it does make you think, well, what then does hold this together? If it is so full of antagonisms, then what keeps the community together? And that's the counterintuitive question to ask, I would have said. What keeps a village together? And therefore, actually locating the social, secular, and religious rituals that are about cooperation and cohesion becomes such a challenge. And therefore, to talk about civic participation I don't know whether being part of a democracy has increased people's civic participation and other things. But what is true is that the other way is certainly the case, that because there is a sense of participation in, if someone says during Eid, for instance, in the Sayyid households, which are the Paka households with big courtyards, they would have a prayer meeting in the evening. So during Ramzan, this is. So through the month of Ramzan, you have prayer meetings. Now, if somebody says, I'm having a prayer meeting, will you attend? Very few people would say no. You just land up, you go for these things. Or if somebody is going to the local block office and needs some help and says, I would feel stronger if I went with two friends, people will go along. If you go to the doctors, so there are. Now, whether that has been caused by greater democratic participation, I don't know. And I think that's an open question.
So your description of the village as, a site of both agonism and suffocation is interesting, because Buddha has a question for you when he says, thank you very much for your thought-provoking talk. And he had two questions. So could you elaborate a little more on the democratic values? So what are the values that are then key to democratic culture? And then sort of linking, it seems your assessment of agrarian life is very different from that of Nehru and Ambedkar. Who very much echo exactly what you described. So I think taking that on, and then his sort of part B is what about protest, disagreement, and the opposition to authority? How does agrarian life contend with these values of democracy? So, particularly thinking about dissent and agonism, not only in terms of electoral outcomes here, I think, but
Yeah.
in terms of dissent.
Thank you for those marvelous questions, because they help me talk about things that I couldn't talk about earlier. Let me just start with Ambedkar and Nehru, because they help me answer the other questions. I know it's very politically incorrect to say this, but I think Ambedkar and Nehru had these very strong views on village India as a den of local, vice, which are really the product of never having lived in a village. We should be able to question our heroes as well. I mean, neither Ambedkar nor Nehru. Ambedkar left village life very early on in very, as we know, strained circumstances, but never as an adult returned to living in a village. He was very much a cosmopolitan, urban, educated person in the way that maybe many people listening to this talk are. And unless you've had familiarity with the village, you would not know what makes it tick. So, and this is equally true of Nehru. And I've checked with the biographers of both great men on this point, because as we know, there was this big schism during the Constitution, and Madhav Khosla writes about this very eloquently in his book, The Founding Moment, about where the location of power will be. And the whole debate of people like Gandhi, but also Radha Kamal Mukherjee, also Harold Lasky. It's a very interesting bunch of people who argue for the village to be the site rather than the state being far more centralized in the way that Nehru and Ambedkar were on the same side. So I think this argument absolutely speaks to that debate and brings it back, and I hope we will bring it back and talk about it much more. And I think anthropologists and sociologists who study village India should link our debates to that constitutional debate much more. What are democratic values? What are they? Well, I think for shorthand, I would say democratic values I am describing in this talk as those of civic republicanism. So civic republicanism requires, it's a shift of emphasis. It's not just, the thing with the democracy is the emphasis is always about the vertical relationship of how the government is formed. People vote for you, you're a representative, that's how you give power to the politicians. Civic republicanism's emphasis is much more on thinking about the distributed nature of popular sovereignty. So citizens are important, and therefore the relationship between citizens is equally important as that vertical relationship. So you need at the horizontal level some mechanics, techniques of creating solidarity and collective action. And at that vertical level, you have to take your popular sovereignty seriously enough to hold elected representatives to account continually between elections. You don't wait just for elections. And it's interesting, if you listen to Obama's speech 2 weeks ago when Biden was giving his victory speech, Obama said exactly this. He says, well done for everybody who worked hard during the election campaign. You worked tirelessly, and we should celebrate it. But remember, it is equally important to keep doing that exhausting work in between elections to genuinely create the democracy you want. And it is that tension that I'm trying to draw your attention to, that democratic values are as much about dissent. Since you ask about dissent, it's absolutely right. If you consider you haven't for 5 years given up your right to call an elected government to account, or to ask questions of them, or indeed to express your displeasure and call into question the unconstitutional nature of laws that may pass, or their manipulation of the judiciary, their corruption of the principle of separation of powers, of parliament not sitting and functioning in a way that a parliamentary democracy is meant to. Absolutely, that is the job of an active citizenry. And those are democratic values.
Uh, Great, thanks. I mean, Mukulika, I think this last point, and you can take this question, I think, and answer it whenever. But it's in the, which really says, of course, it comes from contestation, as you've just said, and it's something you have to keep cultivating. But there's a question here about, from someone that says that, thanking you for this excellent research, but also asking, because of this substantial inviolate commitment, and I'm wondering whether you think these are inviolate, that you have seen developing for different social and economic events across different and social and economic events. Do you consider Indian democracy as matured, right, or mature? And I think so that's a question that I think you already sort of addressed, but you may want to take on. While you do that, let me move to a set of questions that focus a little more on elections and procedure. So there's a question from Kalpana who would like you to sort of, tell us a little bit about the differences in Lok Sabha, Assembly, and Panchayat election experiences specific to the villages that you've worked in. And then Shaina Segal asks, thanking very much for this very insightful masterclass. And a number of people have said that they're greatly looking forward to your book. But she's pushing a little more on the procedural. So she's interested in two interrelated issues: the political nature of redrawing boundaries of existing constituencies or proposals to increase the number of seats in the Lok Sabha from 543 to address the disparity between electoral size and constituencies. At a local scale, these manifest as increasing anxieties around later immigrants and questions on their belongingness by earlier immigrants. So this is visible from her own work in the Andaman Islands and elsewhere in India. And nationally, we have seen this subject invoked around the fertility of social and religious communities and resulting dilution of the electoral base. So, again, in a comparative question, she then asks, isn't this situation analogous to the pleas for electoral reform in the US? So congressional seats in the Electoral College. So there's a set of sort of questions about how we manage and conduct our democracy and parliamentary democracy, and then one about the actual lived experiences of these different levels of elections.
Okay, I'll do my best, and if I forget, Meghla, just remind me. But the first one of mature democracy or not, I think, the fact that it has become, certainly when we were studying it in 2009 for Why India Votes, and before that, my experience in the village, it had been normalized. Voting for elections had been assimilated within a wider repertoire of things that one just does. So elections had been made part of social life in a way that time makes possible. I don't think this would have happened if you read the accounts of the first elections and how people responded to them, in Ornit Shani's work and others. It's a very different approach to elections. This comes with familiarity. It comes with being able to experience elections in the way that everybody experiences Qurbani or fasting during Ramzan. You begin to realize what the rhythm of an election day is. And then next time the election comes, the next time when there is a generational buildup of memory and experience of engaging with elections, you can begin. So yes, you're right. It is a sign of maturing of democracy. And I dare say one of the reasons why one is so concerned about the procedural violence that has been done to the Indian electoral system since 2014 is precisely because we had got to a point where we had a mature engagement with electoral democracy, which has been disrupted for the worse, which very nicely allows me to segue into these procedural issues and electoral reforms. I mean, India really does need a whole slew of electoral reforms. Um, India's parliamentary size constituency, you know, I'll give you an example, a comparative example, which is very simple. I live and work in the UK. The number of seats in the UK is comparable to the number of seats in the Indian election, and you know the relative size of the countries. So I did the figures, and an Indian parliamentary constituency is 20 times the size of a British parliamentary constituency. They are vast. And when you have such a vast parliamentary constituency in a Lok Sabha election, it is impossible, therefore, for any one person to meaningfully engage with a parliamentary constituency population. And therefore, the need for brokers, the need for fixers, the need for money, the use of social media. I mean, all the ways in which campaigns have become more and more managed, you can see. You don't see that, for instance, in Panchayat elections, because it is much more intimate. In a parliamentary constituency, if you look at the Lokniti surveys, they ask a question: do you know the name of the chief minister? Do you know the name of the prime ministerial candidate? Do you know the name of the MP candidate who you're voting for? And people don't, because it is so remote and so big that I think there is a case to be made for increasing the number of seats. And there are pros and cons, of course, but from the point of view of the citizen and the conduct of elections, procedures of elections, you can absolutely see why this is important. And electoral reform is a huge area that we should be having a much bigger national conversation about. But of course, in the current climate, we are not allowed to, especially because the one area that needed reformation has been distorted further. Electoral finance was always a problem in India. It was opaque. It was unregulated. We did not know what sums of money were being spent on elections, how much cash was being flowing, and various scholars have worked on this, showing how we could study this and capture it. I'm thinking of Devesh Kapoor and Milan's Vaishnav's work on cement, on looking at the production of cement and using that as an indication. It's a very interesting argument, but it was very difficult to study it. But now, with the introduction of electoral bonds since February 2016, it's been made officially opaque. So now we have untold sums of money in Indian elections where that's been deliberately made opaque, except to learn that 95% of it goes to the BJP, which is entirely expected. I mean, if you make it opaque to everybody but the State Bank of India and the Government of India, then of course people are putting money into electoral bonds to curry favor with the government, either for carrot or for stick. So there is a case to be made for electoral reform. And therefore, when you study, all these 9 or 10 elections that I witnessed for myself in these, a Panchayat election feels very different to a Vidhan Sabha. You're quite right to ask that question. A Vidhan Sabha is very, it's obviously centered around the figure of the chief minister. And in West Bengal's case, of course, first you had, when I first started field work, it was about Jyoti Basu, then it was about Buddhadev being compared to Jyoti Basu, then how is Mamata good enough to get rid of Buddhadev Bhattacharya. And now we're going to have a completely different context next year because the BJP is so desperate to win West Bengal, and I can say a lot about it, but I won't talk about it here, except to say that when people behave, they have the same commitment to going to vote, but how they approach issues of representation, what kind of factors they take into consideration at a national election, at a Vidhan Sabha and a Panchayat are very distinct. Finally, just to say, the Panchayat elections, which for most rural citizens is the most important election. They know the candidates by name, they know every vote counts. The margins can be very small. There is a lot at stake because, as you know, a lot of funds are dispersed to panchayats who have a huge amount of autonomy in how they spend it, etc., etc. But we have no research on Panchayat elections. In India, we don't know how Panchayat elections are conducted. The Election Commission of India doesn't conduct them. Every state has its own state election commission, which has very few personnel working for it. It is in many ways the opposite to the Election Commission of India. So if there are students looking for and thinking about future research projects, can I just put out a plea for more work on Panchayat elections, and I'll be very happy to share what I have done on it with you.
Great. We are close to, I mean, we're out of time, but there are a couple more questions. I think, and we should be able to wrap. And just like in the previous masterclass, it is really fascinating and wonderful how so many of the questions and the engagement and that you have raised, as well as the questions I've raised, already take us to the next masterclass, which is on conflict and cooperation and collective action, right? So it's nice how that's happening. But these two are very much at the heart of conflict. There are two questions for you on land. So Nidhi, says, thank you very much for this insightful talk. But when you mentioned about land reforms, that leads to rebalancing hierarchies as one of the aspects for social imaginaries for democracy. What if these land reforms actually on the ground lead to strengthening hierarchies instead of breaking them? How do land reforms pan out at the ground level? And what is the impact for our thinking about democracy? And so Bhupendra Kumar, who's at JNU at CPS, asks, for this one, thanks you for this wonderful lecture. And it's a related question on land. Says, in your detail of events, you define the harvest as an event of cross-caste class cooperation, and land distribution led to redistribution of self-respect and dignity. He was wondering that how do you see the burning down of lower caste harvest fields by the dominant castes and violent conflicts that have emerged after redistribution of land and its impact on the democratic process. And this is, drawing on his MPhil work in politics of land reform in Madhya Pradesh, that he's learned how contested and conflicting this site is and how much it leads to the decline of the Congress party in that state. So, thinking about land and the ways in which it is deeply implicated in the story.
Thank you for those questions. Just don't let me forget to talk about Robert Wade's work, right? Because Mekhla, you mentioned irrigation earlier, and that's a very good study. If you don't know it, I urge you to look at it, a book called Village Republics, in which he looks at different kinds of just compares villages and how they manage irrigation and why some villages are able to manage their shared irrigation responsibilities better than others. And he comes up with an argument about village republics and managing of risk and so on. So please look at that, because it's one of the few studies I've come across which is looking at issues of land, agriculture, irrigation, and trying to say something about political values. Right? That's the link that I want to. And because you raised issues of land, I'm reminded of that. Rebalancing of hierarchies and reinforcing of hierarchies. See, I don't think land reform happens in a vacuum. So it happens because of a political agenda. It's an institutional reform. It has been brought about by a government, by a certain political ideology, a commitment to a set of ideas. That's what makes it happen. You need it at that institutional level. When you do it, though, it has intended consequences and unintended consequences. And what you're outlining and what I am reporting to you is how I saw it panning out in an overwhelmingly Muslim village, which was very dominated by caste hierarchy, but how it rebalanced hierarchies in the field of agriculture, in the field of cultivation. The rest of the practices of social distinction continue. So, for instance, very unusually, the Sayyids in these villages speak in Urdu amongst themselves. Now, I talked to various scholars of West Bengal who hadn't come across this anywhere else. So there is a very interesting story of where these Sayyids come from and so on. Their Urdu was really not very good. And I say this as as somebody who grew up in Delhi and lived in Pakistan myself. Their Urdu wasn't very good, but it was incomprehensible enough to the Sayyid Sheikhs and Mughals and the Doms and the Baghdis for them to create boundaries. So it was almost as if, because in, say, the fact that the men were now on the fields cultivating like everybody else, uh, in other social practices, they could reassert it. Marriage continued to be endogamous amongst Sayyids, though again, while I was there, I began to see many them being able to take more Sheikh women into the family, that kind of typical hypergamy that you see in caste endogamy practices elsewhere. So you do see other kinds of they're never, land distribution, land reform never creates only one kind of change. Rebalancing happens in both ways. But here, one thing I want to say about land reform, because I don't know about strengthening hierarchies, but what it did to paddy production in West Bengal is worth noting, because there was this very useful discussion in the literature amongst development economists of whether institutional reform like land reform increases output. And so there's this piece by my colleague Maitrish Khatak and others who compare West Bengal and Bangladesh in the same period, who have both introduced high-yielding varieties of paddy at exactly the same time. And of course, they have exactly the same ecology. But the outputs for West Bengal are higher after land reform. So it does now, that's the one-line summary of a complex article, which you're welcome to go and read. To me, what is interesting is that it tells a story about how institutional reform can create different attitudes to work and labor, about cooperation, about increase of yield on the basis of how much labor you put in or other inputs. Is it fertilizers? Is it not? But if you control for all those other inputs, it ultimately comes down to how much labor and commitment farmers are putting in to the cultivation of paddy in West Bengal and Bangladesh. And there is a very clear divergence. So there is here, at least, you see a collective effort in farming that goes on. People are collectively. So, to go on to the Pubendra's question about lower caste harvest fields, in this context, there aren't any lower caste harvests. All harvests are collective. I can absolutely imagine that if there are harvests that belong primarily to lower castes, that they would absolutely be attacked, because it is a direct. It's like a Dalit schoolboy, getting you look at the caste of merit and this whole discussion of IITs that's going on now with Ajanta Subramaniam's work. The moment there is any assertion of increased output or greater education or greater mobility, there is immediate violence from the upper caste. So in that sense, it's not surprising at all. And land reform, that is why I think what the communists, and I have such a critique of the left front in West Bengal, and I've seen their absolutely worst aspects, which no doubt Ken will talk about next week. But the one thing that the communists did is that land reform, whatever little they did, remember I qualified this, it wasn't at all as good as it was meant to be, but what it achieved was always backed by the Communist Party's protection of sharecroppers and agricultural workers. And that is perhaps what is missing in the Madhya Pradesh case that you're talking about.
I think your answer also sort of answers a question that Vinay has asked about other contexts and how it would be different in say, Uttar Pradesh or elsewhere. So let's end with, sort of reflections on method. Kalpana, the previous question had posed this question around, wanting to hear more about how you arrived at these villages for study. And you had mentioned that. So briefly, if you'd like to talk about that, but we are short on time, and I'm sure you go through that in more detail in the book when it'll be out. So that was one question. And then she had another, which was, in response to your point about claustrophobia, saying that, could you give us practical tips on how to navigate it as an outsider, for scholars, because these are complex places and also claustrophobic, and you mentioned becoming the object of gossip and other things. So I think there was a plea for some help in thinking through those kinds of contexts. But finally, also Asmita, sort of inviting you to sort of give some advice and suggestions for students transitioning from theoretical work on elections and democracies to actually studying it on the ground. And you've spoken in detail, of course, about the ethnographic method. But what of other methods that you think might be useful, that they might be able to read or engage with, particularly for early career scholars who have shorter time horizons? How could you reflect on what would be the useful literatures and ways and approaches methodologically that they could take up?
Gosh, this is going to need a whole different masterclass on methods. So I'll do my best in the few minutes that's left. The way I found these villages was I basically begged the team at Lokniti and CSDS to tell me what their random sample was in West Bengal, which villages, cities, etc. were picked up by the random sample, because it was that Lokniti survey that showed that rural people were more likely to vote than urban ones that had got me started. I visited all the 20 different sites which were covered by the random sample of the survey, decided I would work on these two for a variety of reasons, of convenience, getting to them, the fact that I wanted continuity of studying Muslim societies, etc. And that's how I found them. So they are already part of a randomized sample, is what I wanted to indicate. And when I did, I had no idea that they had this really interesting story of the ancestor of the Sayyids in these two villages had come from Kirman in Iran. They had a really interesting story, which I had no idea. It's typical on a survey; they just show up as a village and with lots of Muslim voters, so it helped their sampling, but that's about it. So it gained depth and width as I got to know these villages over time. How does one navigate it? With patience, I think. It's really quite awful, and I think with writing a diary every night. You write lots of notes when you're in the village, but once the cacophony of conversation and gossip and things like my hair was quite short at the time, and they would say, why haven't you oiled any hair? Come here, let's put some oil in your hair. And they'd take out one of their own combs and want to comb my hair with it and oil it. And, the women would tell me off for being, and, it's a kind of visceral reaction where you can't imagine somebody else's comb in your hair, but you don't, so you have red lines like that. You say, no, I'm sorry, I'm not going to, but you will sit with them and let them oil your hair maybe. So there are all kinds of compromises of that kind of scale one makes. But what kept me sane, and still does when I go to the field, I still do it, is every evening to sit down and actually pour out some of your frustration and anger and disgust into your diary, because it helps you process it. I think that is, and now when I was writing my book and when I write stuff, I often read that diary more than I read my notes. The notes, just by virtue of having written that information down, a lot of that I've internalized and reread it, it's a long time. But the diary is very instructive to add texture to your writing. Asmita's question about elections, I would be very happy to think with any group of scholars who are thinking about studying elections qualitatively. When I began writing about elections, the writing on Indian elections was nowhere as rich as it is now. It's fantastically rich. There is the TCPD work as well that has been in Ashoka, who've been doing wonderful work with available secondary data and asking interesting questions of that data and then visualizing it in different ways. The conversations between TCPD and CPR, Center for Policy Research, on thinking about elections using this data, but also using more field-based methods, it's really a much richer field now than it was 15 years ago. But like I said, I mean, my one plea to anyone thinking about elections is, please let's turn our attention to studying Panchayat elections. They are the critical elections in this 3 tiers of democracy. They're local, like I said, the turnouts are practically 100% in most parts of rural India for Panchayat elections, and yet we don't know anything about them. There is nothing written about it. So if any of you want to get together and have a brainstorm and a quick workshop about Panchayat elections, please drop me a note. The organizers have my email address, so just Google me on LSE. But write to me and we can have another discussion about it and talk about these methods more. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Mukulika. I think your answers to these last questions, I think, were both amazingly honest, but I think also remind one that this is not coming from a place that is naive, but it is hopeful and it is persistent. And it is about patience and working through. And then that's where this kind of engagement, which looks at the possible anew but remains, right? And doesn't take anything for granted. Is so important and so powerful. So thank you so much. I'll hand over to Asmita to thank you formally, and thank you everyone for your wonderful questions.
May I just say, will you save the chat? Because there are all these really interesting comments in the chat, which I'd love to read later. So thank you everyone for your questions and comments.
Right. Wow. It's been such a wonderful, enriching session. And I would like to extend on behalf of the School of Human Ecology, our heartfelt gratitude to Mukulika for taking time out of a really busy semester. When I reached out to you, you said you were swamped with work and the transition to online teaching, and yet you agreed to deliver this masterclass. Thank you so very much. Secondly, I'd like to thank Dr. Suresh Babu, Dean at the School of Human Ecology, for enthusiastically facilitating the masterclass series and the seminar series in general from its very inception. Bekla, thank you so much. Your unique signature on the masterclass yet again added immense value to the lively discussions that were happening in the chat box. I really like the way you string them together. And audience today, thank you so much for enriching the discussion and taking it to the next level. And we really look forward to having you join us yet again. I have to say that the MA and the PhD volunteers at the School of Human Ecology have helped consistently in the middle of very, very busy schedules and in the middle of the pandemic with organizing the SHE seminar series. Thank you especially to Shashank Bharadwaj for his help with the IT end of things. And I also want to acknowledge the hard work that Anirudh Seth puts in cheerfully every time he's called upon to help with emails and the YouTube channel and the live streaming and all the other details. The IT division of AUD deserve a special vote of thanks for handling the technical logistics of this talk. Right now, it's in the midst of an absolutely packed schedule of online MA admissions. I do believe that the time turner was not J.K. Rowling's own invention. It was taken from Ramiz, Mukesh, Deepak, and the others at the IT division in AUD. I don't know how they managed to make so much time out of nothing at all. Fizala Tayabullah at the Center for Urban Ecology and Sustainability. The wonderful posters for the masterclass series continue to make waves. And last but not the least, many, many thanks to Dr. Khudai Das for coordinating the seminar series and for keeping it going. We've had a fantastic set so far. And the next lecture in the series which has already been the ground has been laid so beautifully on conflict and collective action next Wednesday at 4:30 p.m. Indian Standard Time with Kenneth Bo Nielsen, who joined us today also. We'll send you out the details on email too. Thank you all. Thanks so much.